The man stopped in the barn doorway and forgot how to speak. He had driven up the mountain to haul off a load of scrap wood, and instead he was staring at a shelf of eagles, wolves, and one great coiled dragon. Every one of them carved from the cracked, twisted logs the mills had thrown away. The boy who made them was 15, self-taught, out here every evening with his dead grandfather's pocketknife. Ever since his father lost his job and his mother lost her fight with cancer. Before she got sick, she used to tell him one thing: God has never once thrown away what the world called ruined. He only waits for hands patient enough to see it. What neither of them knew, standing in that barn, was that the county was 10 weeks from taking the house, and the pile of garbage out back was the only thing that could save it. Stay with it, because the day that door finally opened, the people who had laughed the loudest were the ones who could not look away. To understand the barn, you have to understand the winter that came before it. The Holt place sat at the end of a gravel road in the mountains west of Asheville. A small farmhouse, a few thin acres of pasture, and a leaning barn whose red paint had faded to the color of old brick. It had belonged to the family for 3 generations. By that winter, it was very nearly all they had left.
Reuben Holt, Levi's father, was 46.
For most of his life, he had worked the maintenance crew at a furniture plant down in the valley. Then the plant cut its workers, and a bad back that had troubled him for years made him an easy name to cross off. One Friday, he was a man with a trade. The next, he was a man at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee going cold, and a stack of bills he could not pay. He had already buried more than a job. 3 years earlier, his wife, Levi's mother Sarah, had lost a long fight with cancer. The boy was 12 when she died. The house still held her in small ways: the curtains she had sewn, the chipped blue bowl no one would use. Then the letter came from the county. The Holts had fallen behind on their property taxes, and the back taxes, interest, and costs came to $4,200. The county had filed to sell the house to settle the debt. One door was still open. If Reuben paid what he owed before the sale was made final, sometime in late winter, the family could keep their home. But $4,200 might as well have been $4 million. He had no work and no way to earn it back before the snow melted. Behind the barn sat the one thing the family had in abundance, and it was the one thing nobody wanted. Ash Hollow Timber, the mill 2 ridges over, had an old arrangement with the Holts. Rather than pay to haul off its cull logs, the cracked ones, the twisted ones, the knots too ugly to mill, the company dumped them behind the Holt barn. It saved the mill a disposal fee. To anyone driving past, it looked like a growing mountain of scrap. The neighbors made their jokes. One told Reuben he had enough firewood back there to last 100 years. Another looked at the heap of discarded hardwood and laughed that it was nothing but scrap. Good for a stove, not much else. They were not cruel men. They simply saw what anyone would see. Garbage the mill had thrown away, piled behind a barn by a family too stubborn to burn it. What none of them knew was what the boy did with it in the evenings when no one was watching. While his father counted what little was left at the kitchen table, the boy did what he always did when the world felt too heavy. He walked out to the barn. Where his father saw a bill he could not pay, Levi Holt saw something else. The boy was 15 now, quiet in a way that made grown men uneasy. He could stand in front of a rough block of maple for whole minutes without blinking, the way another boy might stare into a fire. He did not talk about what he saw there. He carved it. He had been carving for as long as he could remember, and he had taught himself nearly all of it. There was no money for lessons. What he had instead was a shelf of library books gone soft at the corners. A handful of free videos he watched late at night with the sound turned low, and one worn pocketknife. The knife had belonged to his grandfather. Buck Holt, Reuben's father, Levi's grandfather, had been a carver in his day, a man who could turn a fence post into a running horse. When Buck died, the craft that had lived in his hands did not pass to his son. Reuben could fix an engine or hang a door, but wood would never speak to him. The gift skipped a generation and landed on the boy. The pocket knife was the only inheritance that mattered, and Levi carried it everywhere. He had learned the way hardwoods behave the slow way, by ruining them. Maple did not forgive a careless cut the way soft pine did. Walnut and oak had minds of their own, a grain that ran one direction and split if you fought it. So he stopped fighting. He learned to read the grain, to feel where the wood wanted to give and where it would not. He came to think of it less as making something and more as listening. He was not deciding what a log would become. He was waiting to see what it already was. His failures he kept. Other boys hid their mistakes. Levi lined his up on a shelf above the workbench. The owl with one wing too short. The wolf whose face had cracked clean through. He never threw them out. They were how he had learned, and something in him could not bring itself to discard a thing that had already been thrown away once. His father never said much about any of it. But in that house, love was a thing men did with their hands, not their mouths. Reuben sharpened the boys' chisels when they went dull. He cooked breakfast before dawn and left it covered on the stove. And every so often a thrift store woodworking magazine would appear on the kitchen table, folded open to a page on gouges or grain, set there without a word. It was as close as Reuben could come to saying he was proud. Levi had carved birds and wolves from broken branches for years. But one cold afternoon, a single twisted block of maple made him stop and forget the cold. The block had come off the timber truck like all the others, tumbling into the pile out back with a heavy, dead sound. It was a length of maple trunk, too twisted for any mill to bother with. The grain inside it had grown around some old wound, spiraling and doubling back on itself until it looked less like lumber and more like something that had once been alive. Anyone else would have split it for the stove. Levi turned it over in the light of the single bulb that hung from the barn rafter. And then he went still. The grain did not run straight. It rose and bunched and rolled, and in the half-light it read like muscle under skin, like the shoulders of some great animal caught in the middle of moving. He turned the block again slowly. The longer he looked, the more certain he became of what was in there, waiting. A bear. A grizzly, rising onto its hind legs, head lifting, the twist of the grain becoming the heave of its back and the roll of one massive shoulder. He had felt this before, in a smaller way, with the birds and the wolves. Never like this. This was not a chunk of firewood with some shape hidden somewhere inside it. This was the whole animal, pressing out against the wood from within, needing only someone patient enough to carve away everything that was not the bear. That could become something. The thought arrived quietly, the way the important ones always did. He did not tell his father. He did not sketch it on paper. He simply carried the block to the workbench, set it under the light, and opened his grandfather's pocket knife. Somewhere in the house a door closed. The wind leaned against the loose boards of the barn. He turned the maple in his hands one last time, found the first place the grain gave way, and began. For the first time, he wasn't looking at firewood. He was looking at something that might, one day, be worth more than the roof over their heads. The rising bear took shape slowly, an hour here, an hour there, in the cold after supper. But it was a smaller piece that taught him the lesson he would keep the rest of his life. He had been carving an eagle with both wings spread, the way they rode the wind above the ridge. He was nearly finished when he found the flaw, a hairline crack running clean across one wing, thin as a thread, following the grain. A month earlier, he would have carried the whole thing to the fire. He sat with it under the bare bulb a long time. Then he did something he had never tried. He stopped trying to save the wing. He tucked it tight against the body, dropped the head, angled the whole bird downward, and the cracked eagle became a red-tailed hawk in a dive, folded and falling. What was left looked like it had been meant that way from the start. That was the night the work changed. He quit treating every split and knot as an enemy to be beaten down, and began letting the wood's own faults decide the shape. A knot in the walnut became the eye of an owl. He was not fixing wood anymore, he was reading it. He never once bought new lumber. The logs behind the barn had been thrown out once already, and that was exactly why he figured they deserved his best. Inside the house, his father was fighting a different kind of grain. Reuben Holt drove down the mountain most mornings that fall. Clean shirt, boots shined the night before, to ask men half his age for work. The answers came back the same every time, worded politely and meaning one thing. Too many years on him. A bad back the foreman had already heard about. 46 was not old, except on an application, where it was. At night, he sat at the kitchen table with a coffee can of bills and counted, more than once, as if the number might come out different. It never did. $4,200 in back taxes, interest, and costs. And beside the can, the folded letter from the county he could not make himself throw away. Levi heard all of it from the dark of the hallway. The scrape of the chair, the rustle of the letter, the long quiet afterward. He said nothing. That was simply his way. He went back out to the barn and carved, later into the dark than ever, saying not one word about the thing that had begun to burn in him. The thought was still too big to speak, that the pile everyone laughed at might be worth more than any job left in the valley. So he kept that hope where he kept everything that mattered, in his hands and to himself. If you have ever loved something with your hands that other people called a waste of time, a workshop, a garden, an old truck you kept alive, then you already understand this boy. Those are the people we make these stories for. Subscribe and stay in the barn with us. The truck that came up the Holt Road that afternoon did not belong to Ash Hollow Timber. It belonged to Abel Marlowe, a craftsman in his 60s who had spent 40 years bringing dead mountain houses back to life, and who paid honest money for old wood most men would have burned. He had driven up to haul off a load of the mill's scrap for a porch he was rebuilding. He came for the wood. He had no idea there was a boy. He parked beside the pile out back, and that was when he saw the barn door standing open. Abel would say later that he only meant to close it against the weather. He crossed the yard, set his hand on the door, and stopped there in the doorway and forgot how to speak. The shelves ran the whole length of the wall, eagles with every feather cut separate. A pack of wolves caught mid-stride. And in the center, taller than the rest, a coiled dragon rising out of a single twisted log. Every one of them carved from the same thrown-away wood he had driven all this way to cart off his junk. Abel had bought reclaimed lumber for 4 decades. He had never once had it look back at him. He was still standing there when Levi came around the corner, and the boy went stiff the way he did around strangers. Abel did not reach for the easy words. He picked up the diving hawk, turned it over, and asked a real question. "Who taught you to hide the break inside the wing?" "Nobody," Levi said. "It cracked. I used it." Abel set it down slowly. He asked how long the boy had carved, and where he had learned to read the grain. He asked why he never sanded the tool marks out, and when Levi said the marks were the truth of the thing, the old man went quiet. "These are not the work of a beginner," Abel said at last. "But you haven't gone anywhere near as far into this as you can go." Levi did not know what to say to that. "There is a fair," Abel told him. "The last weekend of October, over in town. Real makers. People who come to buy. He said the boy ought to take a table. They are not ready, Levi said. Abel looked at him a long moment. Son, he said, they will never be ready. That was never what ready was for. The fair filled the town hall on the last Saturday in October. Levi came with a folding table his father had loaded in the dark that morning, and 2 boxes of carvings wrapped in newspaper. He set them out the way he set out everything, carefully, without a word. Then he looked up, and the room took the air out of him. Every other table belonged to someone who had been doing this for 30 years. Furniture with dovetails you could not slide a hair into. Gray-haired men with printed cards and prices that did not shake when they said them out loud. And there, wedged between 2 of them, sat a 15-year-old boy with his newspaper and his eagles. People came. That was the hard part. They slowed, and some of them even picked a piece up. A man turned the wolf over, found nothing written on the bottom, and set it down again. They looked, and they liked, and they walked away. By afternoon, the light through the tall windows had gone gray. Levi had sold nothing. Not one piece. He wrapped the carvings back into their newspaper so his father would not have to watch his hands. Reuben found him folding down the empty table. One slow day doesn't decide your future, his father said. He said it easy, the way a man says a thing he has decided to believe. And Levi loved him for it, and did not believe it. Because he knew what his father would never put into words. That it was Reuben carrying the coffee can of bills and the county letter, Reuben who needed this more than anyone in that hall, and would sooner go without than let the boy feel an ounce of the weight. They drove home in the dark, with the radio off. Somewhere along the ridge road, Levi reached into his coat and closed his hand around the worn pocketknife his grandfather had left him. The one thing that had started all of it. And for the first time since he had picked up a blade, he let himself follow the thought all the way to its end. Maybe the neighbors had been right. Maybe it had only ever been firewood. Maybe a boy ought to know when to stop. His thumb found the smooth place worn into the handle by a hand he could barely remember now. He held it the whole way home. He did not open it. Before we go on, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and whether you have ever had a day like this one, where the thing you poured yourself into did not sell, did not land, did not get seen. Stay with him. It is about to turn. The last person to stop at Levi's table had not come to buy anything. She had watched him pack up, a woman in her 30s, wool coat, a small camera bag over one shoulder. Her name was Robin. For most of her 20s, she had made commercials, 30-second promises for things nobody needed, until the morning she walked out and turned her camera on the opposite kind of person, the ones who made something real with their hands and never asked to be seen. That afternoon, she had found a 15-year-old boy folding a blanket over a shelf of carvings that had not sold. She asked to see the wolf again, then the diving hawk. She turned it in the light for a long time. "You made these from what?" she said. "Scrap," Levi said. "Logs the mill throws out." Robin was quiet. Then she asked him something no one had asked before. Not whether the pieces were for sale, but whether she could watch him work. She drove up the mountain 2 days later. Levi almost told her no. But he led her out to the barn, and something in her went still the way it had gone still in Abel Marlowe. The shelves of eagles and wolves, and the one great coiled dragon. All of it carved from wood the world had hauled off as garbage. She set a camera on a tripod in the corner and told him to forget it was there. For hours he did. He worked a block of walnut the way he always worked, the gouge moving in small, sure strokes, sawdust drifting down under the bare bulb. He did not perform. He did not explain. He simply carved, sinking into the same total concentration he fell into every evening, and Robin filmed all of it. The boy, the knife, the cold, the wooden legends behind him stepping out of the dark. She stayed until the light was gone. What she made was short. 6 minutes of a boy, his hands, and the thrown-away wood. She called it The Boy Turning Thrown-Away Wood into Legends, and she put it online on a quiet Sunday night. By morning, it had traveled further than anyone in Ash Hollow had ever traveled. It moved the way true things sometimes move. One person, then 1,000, then more than Robin could count. People wrote in from towns Levi had never heard of. They had all thrown something away, it seemed, and the boy made them wish they had not. Then the phone began to ring. His father, Reuben, answered it standing at the kitchen counter, and answered it again an hour later. And by the third day, he had started writing the orders down in the margins of an old feed calendar, because there was nothing else to write them on. For the first time, the dream that had lived only inside that barn had stepped into the daylight. But daylight came with a deadline of its own. The orders were real, and that was the problem. A carving could not be rushed. A small owl was an evening or two. The larger pieces, the ones people wanted most, took weeks. And the county's date sat there in late winter like a wall at the end of a hallway, coming closer whether the wood was ready or not. They still owed $4,200, and a boy could only hold one gouge at a time. Reuben looked at the calendar full of names and did the math out loud, once, and then stopped doing it. If we're going to do this, he said, we do it right. So they did. Reuben could not carve. The craft had skipped him. But he could work. He replaced the 2 windows that had leaked cold onto the bench for years. He strung a proper line of lights across the rafters so his son could read the grain long after dark. He built a rack for the gouges and chisels, sharpened them the way his own father, Buck, had shown him, and swept the floor every night without being asked. He wanted to haul out the first workbench, the wobbling one Levi had knocked together at 11 from pallet boards. Levi asked him to leave it. He stood it against the wall where he could see it while he worked, to remember where he started. The first real payment came for a leaping trout, 3 days of carving, $140 folded into a card that said only, "Thank you." Reuben held it a while before he set it in the coffee can on the shelf. It was almost nothing against what they owed. It was the first money the barn had ever made. They fell into a rhythm, and the winter kept score. One morning, a bull elk cracked along the grain in the final hour. A rush order. A week of work gone, a man waiting on it. There was no time to save it, and Levi had to write the customer and ask for 2 more weeks. Then snow closed the mountain road for 3 days, and no wood came in. Reuben's back seized on a Tuesday, and he worked the next morning bent sideways, telling Levi it was nothing, which it plainly was not. Still the coffee can filled, $80, then $200, then $300 for a rising grizzly a man drove 90 minutes to collect. Near the end, Reuben carved the one thing he could. On a plank of white oak, he cut 4 plain words, and he hung the sign over the barn door. Holt and Son. By the last week before the county's date, the boy had carved more than he ever had in his life. The question was whether it would be enough. The orders had not stopped since the video. They came in 1s and 2s, then in a stream a boy and his father could barely keep up with. A diving hawk, a great horned owl, a leaping trout, a pair of wolves. The small pieces sold for $80, some for as much as $300. Reuben kept the running total in a spiral notebook, in pencil, the way he counted everything now. By the last week, the column was long. It was also, he knew, still short of $4,200. Then, on a gray Thursday, with the county's date 6 days out, a truck he did not recognize came up the mountain. The man who climbed out owned a lodge 2 ridges over, timber and stone, a fireplace you could stand inside. He had seen the video like everyone else. He walked into the barn, pulled off his gloves, and stood a long time before the one piece Levi had never been willing to sell. It was the coiled dragon, carved from a single twisted length of maple the mill had thrown out for being too knotted to plane. He wanted that one. He asked what it would cost. Levi looked at his father. Reuben looked at the floor. It was the lodge owner who said the number first. $3,000. For one piece of wood the neighbors had called garbage. The next morning, Reuben drove to the county office and paid the $4,200 in full. Back taxes, interest, the cost that had piled on top. He signed where they told him to sign. Then he sat in the truck in the parking lot and did not start the engine. He did not weep. He only sat there, both hands on the wheel, until the heater fogged the glass. The house was theirs. No one was coming to take it. He got home to find an old man waiting by the barn. Clyde had lived down the road for 40 years, a retired carpenter in his 70s, and he was one of the men who, back when the mill first began dumping its culls out back, had leaned on the fence and called the growing pile expensive firewood, and laughed that any boy would haul that junk into a barn. Now he stood turning his cap in his hands. When Reuben and Levi walked up, he took the cap off entirely and held it against his chest. He said he had passed that wood pile most of his life, to town, to church, to nothing at all. In all those years, he said, he had never once looked at those logs and seen a single thing the boy had seen in them. He was an old carpenter. He had worked wood his whole life. And a 15-year-old had shown him he had been walking by it half blind. Levi did not know what to say. After a moment, he said the only true thing he could think of. "They're the same logs," he said. "Nothing changed about the wood." Clyde nodded, slow. He said he knew that, and that it was the part that kept him up nights. The wood had been the same all along. "You didn't change the logs, son," he said. "You taught the whole road to look at them twice. The house was safe. But the thing Clyde said stayed in the barn long after he left. Word travels fast on a mountain. The mill that once dumped its rejects behind the barn to save the cost of hauling them off began doing something it never had. When a log came off the saw with figure in it, curl in the maple, a burl swelling out of a walnut, grain that turned and caught the light, the men at Ash Hollow Timber set it aside. They called the Holt place first. The wood nobody had wanted was now the wood they saved. The neighbors changed too, though slower, the way people do. Some of the same men who had laughed began to find reasons to drive up. A few brought their sons and grandsons and stood them at the barn door to watch the boy work. They wanted the boys to see something, though most of them could not have said exactly what. Maybe only this, that a thing worth doing gets built one plain afternoon after another by somebody patient enough to keep at it. Levi did not let any of it turn his head. He still bought no new lumber. He worked what came off the truck, cracked, twisted, split, the pieces the mill had given up on. When people asked why, he gave an answer that was not really an answer. The wood had already been thrown away once, he told them. That was exactly why it deserved the best he had. He was not going to be the second person to quit on it. Reuben worked beside him most days now, sweeping, sharpening the gouges, boxing finished pieces for shipping, doing the parts a father could do when the gift itself had skipped him. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of it and simply watch his son from the far side of the workshop. He never said anything. He was watching a 15-year-old become the thing Reuben had once quietly hoped the world might let him become. Back before the layoff, before the illness, before the stack of bills. And here it was, happening in a leaning red barn, out of the wood everyone else had thrown away. The trucks still came every Tuesday. The logs still landed with the same heavy sound. Nothing about the wood had changed. Only the people looking at it had. Some evenings, after the last order is boxed and the sawdust has settled under the hanging bulb, the boy stays in the barn a while longer. He still carries the same worn pocket knife his grandfather Buck left him, the one thing that came down through the family when almost everything else nearly went. He had learned young that the things the world calls finished are rarely as finished as they look. A cracked log, a leaning barn, a man who lost his work, a family the county had a date to put out on the road. None of it was as done as it had seemed. His mother's words came back to him sometimes, Sarah, before she got sick, telling him that nothing the world called ruined was ever truly thrown out by God, only set aside to wait on hands patient enough to see it. For a long time he had thought she was talking about the wood. Standing in the barn that had almost been taken, with his father working again a few feet away, he understood at last that she never only had been. The ruined thing that had not been let go of was not a log, or a carving, or even the house. It was the family, a father and a son still standing together in a barn that had nearly stopped being theirs. If there is something in your own life that everyone else has called finished, a talent, a place, a person, a second chance you are afraid to start, share this with someone who needs to believe it is not over. And tell us, what did the world throw away that turned out to be worth everything?